The polished wood of the conference room gleamed under the electric lights, reflecting the grim faces of the men. Seated around the large table. It was October 26, 1944, in Berlin. The air was thick with smoke and a simmering, impotent rage. These were Germany's top fighter commanders. Men who had flown hundreds of combat missions, men who had watched their squadrons bleed to death in the skies over the Reich, men who carried scars, both visible and invisible, from years of brutal air combat. And now, their commander-in-chief, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, stood before them and called them cowards. His face was flushed, his bulk seeming to swell with indignation. "You are afraid," he shouted, the words striking the men like physical blows. "Your pilots lack courage! They refuse to engage the enemy! The Luftwaffe's honor is being destroyed by your weakness." A stifling silence followed the tirade. These were not staff officers, they were warriors. Men like Joseph, Pips, Priller, a veteran of the Battle of Britain, and Joyu Enthereluzzo, who had lost an eye in combat but had returned to the cockpit. They had given everything, and now they were being accused of cowardice by a man who had grown soft and distant in his palatial estates. Then, a chair scraped back. Lieutenant General Adolf Galland, the General der Jagdflieger, the head of all Luftwaffe fighter forces, stood up. At 32. He was the youngest general in the German military, a living legend with 104 confirmed kills etched into the fuselage of his Messerschmitt. He had been fighting since the Condor Legion in Spain in 1937. He was done being quiet. He placed a folder on the table. His voice was calm, a stark contrast to Göring's bluster. Inside was a plan he called Der Großschlag, the big punch. It was a concept of brutal, final simplicity. Accumulate every single available fighter. Strip units from the Eastern Front, from the Mediterranean, from the homeland defense. Pull aircraft straight from the production lines. Assemble a force of 700 German fighters, the largest formation ever created. Then they would wait. Wait for a day of perfect weather, when the American bomber streams would be vast and visible. And then they would launch everything. Nothing would be held back. Even the generals would fly. It was a gambler's last, desperate throw of the dice. The goal was not to win the air war. That was now an impossibility. The goal was to inflict such catastrophic losses, 500, 600, perhaps even 700 bombers in a single day, that American public opinion would recoil, that Roosevelt would be forced to the negotiating table before Germany was completely crushed. Göring listened, his expression unreadable. He paced slowly around the table, his eyes fixed on Galland. He stopped directly in front of the younger man. For a moment, it seemed he might actually be considering the audacity of the plan. Then, his hand shot out. He grabbed the knight's cross with oak leaves, swords and diamonds that hung from Galland's neck. With a brutal wrench, he tore the decorations from Galland's chest and flung them onto the polished conference table. The medals skittered across the wood, their glittering facets catching the light. "I'll put them back on," Göring snarled. "When your damned fighter pilots start shooting planes down again." The room was frozen. Galland stood perfectly still, the empty clips on his tunic a more profound humiliation than any shouted insult. In that moment, the last vestiges of his belief in the high command evaporated. He had thought presenting this aggressive, all or nothing plan would prove the fighter arm's courage. Instead, its very desperation had revealed a truth the Nazi leadership refused to accept. The Luftwaffe wasn't losing because of cowardice. It was losing because of mathematics. And no amount of courage, no quantity of medals, could overcome the cold, hard arithmetic of industrial warfare. Adolf Galland was everything the Nazi propaganda machine loved. Born in 1912 in Westerholt, he was possessed by a pure, unadulterated passion for aviation, learning to fly gliders as a teenager. When Hitler secretly rebuilt the Luftwaffe in violation of the Treaty of Versailles, Galland was among the first volunteers. By 1937, he was flying ground, attack missions in Spain with the Condé Legion, testing the close, support tactics that would later devastate Poland and France. But his true talent emerged in the cockpit of a fighter. During the Battle of France in May 1940, he transitioned to Messerschmitt Bf 109s and discovered he possessed an exceptional, almost instinctual, gift for air combat. By the end of the Battle of Britain, he had 17 confirmed victories. By 1941, he had surpassed the revered Werner Emmerlorders to become the Luftwaffe's leading ace. His aggressiveness, tactical brilliance, and uncanny ability to survive made him a national hero. At 29, in November 1941, he was promoted to General der Jagdflieger, responsible for all fighter operations. He was the youngest general in the German armed forces. It should have been the pinnacle of his career. Instead, it became a front row seat to Germany's slow motion collapse. The problem was simple but insoluble. The Luftwaffe had been designed for blitzkrieg. Short, decisive campaigns where air superiority was achieved quickly, ground forces advanced, and the enemy collapsed before resources ran low. It had worked in Poland, Norway, France, and the Balkans. But it had failed catastrophically over Britain and the vast expanse of Russia. By 1943, Galland faced a nightmare scenario. American and British strategic bombing was intensifying into a round-the-clock assault. The US 8th Air Force sent hundreds of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators to pulverize German industry by day, while RAF Bomber Command pounded cities into rubble by night. The Luftwaffe had to defend an entire continent with resources that were dwindling by the week. Galland understood the mathematics of the situation. In early 1943, he and Field Marshal Erhard Milch had worked out a production plan to build 1,000 fighters per month by mid-year. The justification was stark. Allied bomber formations were growing exponentially. Without a massive surge in fighter production, Germany would inevitably lose air superiority over its own territory. But getting Hitler and Göring to approve the plan required political maneuvering. Milch had to justify it as supporting future offensive operations, not defense, because Hitler despised any strategy that smelled of defensiveness. The plan was approved, but it was already too late. By the time German production finally ramped up, the Allies had solved their most critical weakness range. In early 1944, the North American P-51 Mustang, equipped with sleek, jettisonable drop tanks, began appearing in the skies over Berlin. It could accompany the bombers all the way to their targets and back. The Mustang was a revelation. Faster than the Bf 109 at most altitudes, more maneuverable, and blessed with an endurance that German pilots could only envy. Suddenly, the Jagdflieger weren't just fighting box formations of bombers, they were fighting swarms of agile, long-range American fighters that could outperform them. February 1944 brought unmitigated disaster. During Big Week, the Allies launched a coordinated, around-the-clock bombing campaign targeting German aircraft factories and assembly plants. The Luftwaffe rose to defend, as it had to, and was systematically destroyed. Galland watched from his command post, as the units he had built from scratch were shredded by the relentless American escorts. The twin-engine, Zerster units, flying Bf 110s and Me 410s, were particularly devastated. Nearly 100 pilots were killed in a single week. 17% of the entire fighter force was wiped out. In mid-May 1944, Galland met with Göring to present the grim statistics of pilot losses. The numbers were catastrophic. Luftwaffe, defending Germany itself, had lost 38% of its fighter pilots in April. Luftwaffe in France had lost 24%. Total losses 489 pilots, including 100 experienced officers. The training schools had managed to produce only 396 replacement pilots. with a mere 62 officers among them. The Luftwaffe was bleeding its lifeblood. Experienced aircrew, faster than it could possibly replace it. Galland's proposals were those of a man trying to staunch a hemorrhaging wound. He suggested limiting interceptions to conserve pilot strength, to only engage when conditions favoured the German fighters, to avoid costly head-on attacks against massed formations, to break off when the American escorts appeared. Göring rejected everything. He demanded maximum effort against every raid, regardless of the tactical situation. Anything less, he roared, was cowardice. The pilot shortage had a simple, brutal cause. Germany could no longer afford to train its pilots properly. New Luftwaffe pilots were arriving at frontline units with as little as 100 total flying hours. Their American counterparts arrived in England with over 400 hours, including extensive gunnery, formation, and tactical training. The experience gap wasn't just numerical, it was lethal. Green, frightened German teenagers were being thrown into the meat grinder against veteran American fighter pilots who had already mastered their craft. They were not being defeated, they were being slaughtered. By August 1944, the Luftwaffe on the Western Front had reached its lowest ebb of operational effectiveness. Galland visited squadrons that, on paper, should have fielded 100 aircraft, but struggled to put 50 in the air. Units that had fought since the invasion of Poland were now hollow shells, their ranks filled with replacements who often did not survive their first 5 missions. The veterans, the men who had mastered the art of air combat through years of hard-won experience, were almost all dead, and they could not be replaced. Hermann Göring, however, was living in a fantasy. As Reichsmarschall and Hitler's designated successor, he wielded immense power, but by 1944, that power was built on a foundation of denial and delusion. Göring had promised Hitler the Luftwaffe would protect Germany from the terror of the bombers. When the RAF first struck Berlin in 1940, he had famously declared, "You can call me Meyer if a single enemy bomb falls on the capital." The joke had turned bitterly hollow, as Berlin was burned to ashes, block by block. Göring's response to failure was to seek scapegoats. If the Luftwaffe wasn't stopping the Allied bombers, it must be because the fighter pilots lacked the necessary courage. If German aces weren't achieving the kill ratios of 1940, they must have grown soft and cowardly. The idea that Germany was being systematically overwhelmed by superior numbers and industrial production was intolerable. It suggested the entire Nazi project, with its ideology of racial superiority and willpower, was a failure. The October 26th meeting had been called for one purpose: to humiliate the fighter commanders into accepting Göring's narrative. But when Galland stood and presented Der Großschlag, he flipped the script. He was not making excuses, he was presenting a solution of such staggering audacity that it forced a confrontation with reality. And Göring, in tearing off the medals, was not just punishing Galland, he was rejecting that reality. The plan's all, or nothing nature. Its acknowledgement that Germany could not win through sustained combat, its sheer desperation, all of it screamed defeat. As Galland stood there, the phantom weight of his missing medals heavy on his chest, he realized the plan was doomed for reasons beyond Göring's pride. He knew the Luftwaffe was literally running out of the means to fight. Allied bombing of the Romanian oil fields and Germany's own synthetic fuel plants had been devastating. In March 1944, Germany produced 180,000 tons of aviation fuel. By September, it was 50,000 tons. By November, it would plummet to a mere 20,000 tons. You cannot fly 700 fighters without fuel. You cannot train replacement pilots without fuel. You cannot even run an engine for maintenance checks without fuel. The pilot shortage was equally insurmountable. Even if by some miracle Germany could assemble 700 aircraft, Where would it find 700 competent pilots? Training new pilots required fuel for training flights. It required experienced instructors, who were all dead or at the front. And it required time. The one commodity Germany had completely exhausted as Allied armies advanced from the east and the west. There was another, deeper problem Galland understood but could never voice aloud. The industrial arithmetic was impossible. Yes, in a final, frantic effort, German factories were producing fighters at record rates. In August 1944, they built over 4,000 fighters, a figure that momentarily matched Soviet and American output. But production numbers were meaningless if the aircraft sat idle on the ground. If there was no fuel, if there were no spare parts, if the Allied bombers destroyed the factories the following week. America was building P-51 Mustangs and training pilots with an efficiency that treated aircraft and men as disposable resources. For every German fighter lost, its replacement was uncertain. For every American fighter lost, 3 more were already crossing the Atlantic. Galland left the conference room knowing F. der Großschlag was dead. Hitler had different plans. Unbeknownst to Galland, the FU was preparing the Ardennes offensive, the operation that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler wanted Galland's precious fighter reserves diverted to support this last great ground attack, not wasted on a defensive operation against bombers. Days after the humiliating meeting, Göring appointed Dietrich Peltz, a bomber pilot, to command Jagdkorps Siem, which controlled fighters on the Western Front. Peltz was chosen precisely because he was not a fighter ace. He would follow orders without the inconvenient habit of questioning their feasibility. Galland, the aggressive and blunt fighter legend, was being sidelined. His influence was evaporating. The final, bastardized version of Galland's concept became Operation Bodenplatte, Wasserplate, launched on January 1, 1945. Instead of a concentrated blow against the American bomber streams, it targeted Allied airfields in France, Belgium, and Holland. The goal was to destroy Allied aircraft on the ground to support the flagging Ardennes offensive. Nearly 900 Luftwaffe fighters participated. It was the largest German air operation since 1940. Operation Bodenplatte was a catastrophic disaster. It succeeded in destroying 156 Allied aircraft on the ground, but German losses were soul-crushing. Over 300 Luftwaffe aircraft were shot down, with 237 pilots killed, missing, or captured. Many of these losses came from friendly fire. The operation was so shrouded in secrecy that German flak units were not informed and merrily shot down their own returning fighters. The Luftwaffe had traded 3 of its own aircraft and their irreplaceable pilots for every 1 Allied plane destroyed. Worse still, the veteran pilots who were lost in this futile operation could not be replaced. The Ardennes offensive failed. The air superiority the Germans had briefly bought with 3 weeks of bad weather vanished the moment the skies cleared. The surviving Luftwaffe fighters were decimated in the battles that followed. Galland's relationship with Göring collapsed completely. In early January 1945, Göring summoned Galland and formally relieved him of command. The official reason was failure to prevent Allied bombing. The real reason was that Galland had become a living symbol of uncomfortable truths. He represented the unbridgeable gap between Nazi fantasy and military reality. In a final act of defiance, fighter pilots loyal to Galland staged what became known as the Fighter Pilots' Revolt. Senior commanders confronted Göring about impossible orders, inadequate resources, and the constant scapegoating of pilots for strategic failures. Göring responded with predictable rage. Galland was placed under house arrest at his hunting lodge. Charges of treason were prepared. SS head Heinrich Himmler, ever eager to expand his power, piled on accusations of disloyalty, defeatism, and incompetence. The revolt fizzled when Hitler himself intervened. The FU Heer had no particular love for Göring by this point, but he could not afford a civil war within the Luftwaffe. Hitler stopped the treason charges and offered Galland a face-saving alternative. Instead of a court-martial and a firing squad, Galland was ordered to form an elite jet fighter unit, flying the revolutionary Messerschmitt Me-262. Jagdverband 4th became Galland's final command. He assembled a cadre of veteran pilots, men who had survived the years of carnage. Experts and aces who were now as disillusioned as he was. They flew the Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. With a top speed of over 540 miles per hour, it was untouchable in level flight by any Allied piston-engine aircraft. In theory, it should have been a war-winning weapon, sweeping the skies clear of bombers. In practice, it arrived 2 years too late. Only about 400 were produced before the war's end. Crippling fuel shortages meant many of them never left their dispersal pens. The jets were acutely vulnerable during their slow takeoff and landing phases, and Allied fighters learned to wait in the weeds, loitering near Me-262 airfields to pounce when the jets were slow and helpless. Galland himself was shot down and wounded in April 1945, barely surviving a crash landing. JV-44 operated for less than 2 months before Germany surrendered. The unit claimed roughly 50 Allied aircraft shot down while losing 27 of its own jets. It was a tactical success but a strategic irrelevance. The war was over. Germany was defeated. The Me-262, like a der Großschlag, represented a brilliant, tantalizing, if that had been crushed by the relentless, grinding wheels of industrial and logistical reality. The fundamental problem was one of simple, brutal arithmetic. Germany's entire aircraft production from 1939 to 1945 totaled approximately 119,000 aircraft. American production in the same period exceeded 300,000. The Soviet Union produced over 157,000. Britain produced 131,000. Germany was fighting a coalition that collectively outproduced it by a ratio of 6-1. The disparity in pilot training was just as telling. By late 1944, an American fighter pilot arrived in Europe with over 400 flying hours in his logbook. His German counterpart arrived at his frontline unit with 100 hours or less. The USAAF could afford to train its pilots thoroughly because it had limitless fuel, ample training aircraft, and a pool of experienced instructors. Germany was so desperate, it was sending teenagers into the most demanding form of aerial combat with little more than the basic ability to take off and land. The fuel crisis was the final, decisive blow. Albert Speer, Germany's armaments minister, later admitted that if the Allied bombing of the Romanian oil fields had continued for just 1 more month in 1944, the entire Wehrmacht would have been paralyzed. By the end of 1944, 98% of Germany's aviation fuel production capacity was destroyed. You cannot fly fighters without fuel. You cannot train pilots without fuel. You cannot sustain a modern air force without fuel. Adolf Galland survived the war. After a brief period of captivity, he was released and eventually moved to Argentina, where he worked as an aviation consultant for the Perón government. He returned to Germany in the 1950s and became a successful businessman. He wrote his memoirs, The First and the Last, which stands as one of the most important and clear-eyed first-hand accounts of the Luftwaffe's rise and fall. He died in 1996 at the age of 83, one of the last surviving senior Luftwaffe officers. But his real legacy was not his 104 victories or his general's rank. It was what he represented in that wood-panelled conference room on October 26, 1944. He was the man who told the truth when everyone else was lying. He presented facts when the leadership demanded fantasy. He acknowledged defeat when the regime required blind confidence. And for that honesty, his medals were torn from his chest and his career was destroyed. Der Großschlag was never really about tactics or strategy. It was about mathematics. Galland had calculated what it would take to hurt the Allies badly enough to force a political solution. The answer was everything Germany had used once, under perfect conditions. The plan's sheer desperation revealed the unvarnished truth. Germany could not win a war of attrition because it lacked the industrial base, the resources, and the time for sustained operations. Hermann Göring understood this on some visceral level. That is why he reacted with such theatrical fury. Galland's plan was not an insult to pilot courage. It was an admission that courage was no longer enough. The Luftwaffe was failing not because its pilots were cowards, but because American factories in Detroit and Willow Run were building aircraft faster than German pilots could shoot them down. Because the oil fields of Texas and the refineries of the Gulf Coast produced fuel on a scale Germany could not comprehend. Because the training fields in Florida and California were graduating skilled aviators by the tens of thousands. The numbers told an undeniable story. In 1944 alone, the United States produced 96 30-18 aircraft. Germany produced 39 807. The American advantage was more than 2 to 1. And that was before adding in the tens of thousands of aircraft produced by Britain and the Soviet Union. Germany was fighting a war of attrition it was mathematically certain to lose. The tragedy of October 26, 1944, was not that Göring humiliated Galland. The tragedy was that Germany's leadership had spent years ignoring men like Galland, who understood the arithmetic of modern total war. If Germany had prioritized fighter production and pilot training in 1941 instead of 1943, if it had invested in rational resource allocation instead of squandering its strength on prestige projects and wonder weapons, the air war might have had a different, far more protracted and bloody conclusion. But the Nazi leadership was incapable of making rational decisions because its worldview was built on a foundation of fantasy. They believed German racial superiority would overcome material disadvantages. They believed willpower could substitute for industrial capacity. They believed their enemies were weak, decadent, and would collapse if hit hard enough. Galland's crime was not cowardice. It was realism. He had calculated the odds and found them insurmountable. He had proposed a desperate measure because only desperate measures remained. And when he presented those cold calculations to the Reichsmarschall, the response was to tear off his medals and scream about courage. The scene crystallized the entire strategic failure of the Third Reich. The men who knew the truth were silenced. The men who told comfortable lies were promoted. And the war machine kept grinding forward toward inevitable total defeat because no one at the top possessed the courage to admit that they had already lost. By May 1945, when Germany surrendered, the Luftwaffe had roughly 3,000 frontline aircraft remaining. They sat on shattered airfields, grounded for lack of fuel, lack of trained pilots, lack of spare parts. The industrial base that supported them was a landscape of rubble. The training schools were silent. The veteran pilots were dead, in prisoner of war camps or broken men. Everything Galland had warned about had come to pass. His medals, the ones Göring had thrown onto the polished table, told one story. They represented courage under fire, tactical brilliance, and leadership in combat. But they were powerless against mathematics. They could not manufacture fuel that did not exist. They could not train pilots without aircraft or time. They could not make Germany's industrial base competitive with the combined output of the United States, the British Empire, and the Soviet Union. In the end, Adolf Galland was right. The Luftwaffe's failure wasn't about courage. It was about arithmetic. And no amount of rage from a Reichsmarschall, no quantity of gleaming medals, could change the fact that Germany had entered a war of production. It was mathematically destined to lose. The medals on the table represented everything the Luftwaffe had been. The empty, silent room after the meeting ended represented all that was left.